Failure is probably the most important factor in all of my work. Writing is failure, over and over and over again. My name is Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm a writer. Right now I'm a national correspondent for The Atlantic. I have a great interest in how wide the umbrella of human rights and democracy can expand, who it can include and who it can include. If you truly want to understand a problem, if you truly want to understand, a situation, which is what, journalism is supposed to be about, you really have to have a firm grounding in history. My argument for reparations for slavery is quite simple. African Americans from, the time that they arrived in colonial America, through the time in the founding of the country, through their enslavement through that period, up through Jim Crow, if you want to be conservative, up through 1968, the relationship between black people and their country is of their country taking from them. There's no way to have a 250 plus year history of extracting resources from a community and think you're going to fix the problems within that community without putting at least some of that back. That's the case for reparations. It's actually quite simple. Well, West Baltimore shaped me a great deal. I was born in 1975. Only 7 years after Martin Luther King was killed, 10 years after Malcolm X was killed. And I emerged into a city in America where it appeared that African Americans were going to have all the promises that had been withheld from them, and on paper had a great deal of them. And yet the effects of history were all around me. And one of the dominant ideas, in the book Between the World and Me, which is, effectively an extended essay, told in a letter form to my son, is the notion of fear. For me, the immediate thing I saw was this lack of physical safety. The inability to secure your body, to protect your body from violence, from people who, live around you, from, forces that live outside of your community, as well as within your community. As a young person, I was simply obsessed with why that was. And that probably is the lion's share of my work. I was motivated to pursue a career as a journalist because I was always an inquisitive child. I was always one to ask questions. Journalism was a career in which I got to pick the questions I wanted to ask, and then somebody paid me for asking them. And the challenge of writing is to see your horribleness on page, to see your terribleness, and then to go to bed and wake up the next day and take that horribleness and that terribleness and refine it and make it not so terrible and not so horrible. And then to go to bed again and come the next day and refine it a little bit more and make it not so bad. And then go to bed the next day and do it again and then make it maybe average. And then one more time, if you're lucky, maybe you get too good. And if you've done that, that's a success. When I first got the call from the MacArthur Foundation, I was ecstatic. And then I was deeply honored. We labor in the dark. If anybody even reads what I'm doing, that's a great day.
And then I started to look into this issue, and what I found was startling to me. Was since 1980 in the United States of America, 630,000 American citizens have been killed on the streets of America, 630,000. And there is a culture of violence that permeates in certain segments of the United States of America. 95% of the victims of crime in my city are young African American men. They're between 16 and 25, and 88% of them know each other. I have used the phrase a culture of violence that evidently tweaks people's brains and says it's really not a culture, and black people are not as bad as white people, and as many white people get killed. And I use the term because I used it in a specific way, and that is a pattern of behavior that developed over time that has produced a certain result over and over again, so that it became a normative action for some people. Because they say, hey man, it's kill or be killed. I have a gun because if I don't have one, somebody's going to shoot me. I have to protect myself.
The culture of violence in these communities is that to talk about culture is to kind of avoid talking about all the sort of structured racism that we've had over the past 400 years in this country that have led to certain conditions. So just talk about that a little bit and react to what the mayor is talking about in terms of the importance of culture or the lack of importance of culture.
And I'll tell you guys a story that I tell all the time. I guess I would have been about 11 years old and going off to middle school. Every morning when I got up and got dressed to go to middle school and I got my stuff together, it was an entire ritual that I had to take myself through. That ritual generally concerned how I was dressed. It concerned how I was going to wear my backpack. There was an entire ritual that I had to go through at lunchtime. Was I actually going to go to lunch that day? Was I going to try to cut lunch and wander the hallways? And then after school, how was I going to go home? Was I going to go home right away? Was I going to stay for coach class? And when I left, again, who was I walking with? How many of them was it? Which direction was I taking? Was I going to take the very, very long route? Every single one of those decisions was totally committed to the mission of keeping violence from being done to my body. I would say each day, a third of my brain was dedicated to negotiating violence. When I talked to my cousins, for instance, who lived in Philadelphia, when I talked to my father's friends who lived in Chicago, who were roughly my age or about my age, they lived under the same sort of situation. They went through the same sort of rituals every day. Now, for some reason, we had very, very similar rituals, even though we were in different cities. You would find a similar sort of ritual that young African-American males and females also go through to shield themselves against violence. And so I knew, as an African-American, as a member of a minority population, that these sort of rituals that we went through, I think what the mayor would call a culture of violence, but I would call a culture of self-preservation. I think what we often miss when we talk about culture is it becomes an easy way to not acknowledge the fact that people are actually making rational decisions within the life, within the structures, within the places that they live.
How was that culture created?
It's quite clear how that culture is created. African-American life in this country has been violent from the moment we got here in 1619. There's always been a culture of violence that was put upon us. And during that period, we have redlining to make sure we herd certain people into certain neighborhoods. We deprive those neighborhoods of resources. We deprive those neighborhoods of jobs. We create what people call, what sociologists call criminogenic conditions. And then we're shocked that the murder rate is higher there. Why are you shocked? But it's also to be expected if you render an honest, reading of American history. All of these, cases where we've seen, this Black Lives Matter movement come up, there's been a great deal of focus on what's being called police reform. My argument is, in fact, we have a much, much deeper problem, and that is that we are asking the police to do certain things that maybe they shouldn't do. Take, that horrible video you see where Walter Scott is shot in the back by an officer. Freddie Gray is another case. You have a situation where a gentleman is in an area that we've designated as high crime. He makes the mistake of making eye contact with the police officer, and then he runs. The reason why Freddie Gray was arrested was because we have made a decision that we're going to pursue our drug policy in a certain way in that area. Why did we have police there in the first place? Why did we have a situation in which we decided the police will be able to arrest people effectively or stop and search somebody effectively because they, look suspicious? There are other ways that we could think about doing this, but we decided not to. The expectation that, catching things on tape is going to save us is, I would say deeply flawed. Even sometimes when things are caught on tape, that doesn't necessarily mean that anything is going to happen. You really can't be an African American in this country and see, say, a Walter Scott video and be completely amazed. You've had interactions with police. You know people who bad things have happened to just for being who they are. My name is Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is my brief but spectacular take on the legacy of white supremacy and its continuing function in our society today.
It is often said that Trump has no real ideology, which is not true. His ideology is white supremacy and all its truculent and sanctimonious power. In Trump, he states white supremacists see one of their own.
It's always the white supremacist who's being offended. It's always him that something's being done to. So I think it's, pretty characteristic in a form.
The conceit of the piece, which is that Donald Trump is the first white president,
right,
is a really gripping one. What's the basic idea?
Well, I wanted to attack the basic notion that whiteness is ultimately about phenotype. Whiteness actually has to, come from a certain place, and throughout American history, what it's come from is the negation of blackness. One of the fascinating things about Trump is not so much that, he has a history of racism, has a history of being a white supremacist. We've had other white presidents who are just like that. We've never had a president who so much defined himself by the president that was before him, who just so happens to be our first black president. You can't actually have a white president, the idea of a white president, without having a black president before him, much just as you cannot have a white America in this country without having a black America.
You're using it in a much more expansive sense. What is that doing? Why are you doing that?
Well, I think if your response to the first black president is that they weren't born in this country, if you say they weren't smart enough to go to Harvard Law School and demand to see their grades, if that's the essence of your entire political identity, you might be a white supremacist. But you might be, and I think with Donald Trump, it's quite a bit. For instance, I wouldn't say George Bush is a white supremacist. Now, I wouldn't argue that Mitt Romney is a white supremacist. Donald Trump is a particular, specific thing, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence to back up the charge.
I want to talk about the sort of the cause of the Trump win. You sort of lay out this case of like, the reason Trump's president is white people.
Right.
Because he won every category of it, right? He won them geographically, he won them by income, he won them by education level, by gender, etc. But there's this part that struck out to me, right? Trump won white women +9 and white men +31. And then you say he won white people with college degrees +3 and white people without them, 37. And I read that in the piece when you're making this point about like, let's just think about this as whiteness. But I saw that difference between 3 and 37 and my mind was like, well, there's something going on there.
There is something going on there.
There's something like this obsession with the white working class, or white non-college as it's called. And like there is a numerical basis for that, right?
Right. There is a tendency to pay attention to one adjective more than the other. White people in this country, or the white working class in this country, in terms of their votes, are not, remarkable in terms of their working classness, but in terms of their whiteness. That's what puts them in league with everybody else. You're right. Yeah, more white working class people went for him, but black working class people didn't go for him at all. It's the whiteness that's similar across the board, that goes across class, that goes across gender, that goes across education. What's the thing that's most common? And the sad thing is, it's the whiteness. That's what's most common, not the workingness, not the fact of being a member of the working class.